Salams, you're watching People's Dispatch, and this is the daily debrief coming to you from our studios here in New Delhi. I'm Siddhant Dani, and we have a lot to get through on the show today, including Brazil's president's state visit to China, a long awaited visit that was delayed for around 2 months after the Brazilian president contracted pneumonia. That's on now. We look at what these two major economies will be talking about, what's on the agenda there. We're also looking at the largest joint military exercises between the United States and the Philippines, in which over a dozen or so regional countries are participating and are being held in the South China Sea, the kind of impact that those exercises will have on the security situation and, of course, overall relations in the region. Anish, who covers the region, will be joining us for that. And we close actually also on a similar subject, an extension of it, based on a new book that has come out. We look at the lasting and often forgotten impact of the United States' wars around the world. We have Anish with us now to talk about our top story, which is Brazilian President Lula's visit to China. Anish, the visit begins. It's been a bit delayed, but an important one nevertheless, particularly for those of us who are part of the world that is encapsulated by the BRICS nations, and of course for these days having a much wider sort of impact as well. What's on the agenda? Brazil and China, of course, the biggest trading partners. So economic ties, strengthening economic ties must be right up there.
Oh, definitely, because we have to remember the kind of damage, at least as far as the Brazilian economy, its major business houses, and even the government is concerned. It is trying to undo the sort of damage that was done under the Bolsonaro administration, where statements, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, made against China by not just Bolsonaro, but also his family members who were also political leaders, showed a certain, created a certain rift. A rift, I say, is a very, a very mild way to put it, considering the fact that it actually essentially froze any kind of development in the relations. I mean, like it did not undo anything in the manner that that would, prevent trade or any kind of bilateral relations, but it definitely prevented any new thing from happening. And it also, kind of gave a chilling effect to investors from China to invest in projects, new projects in Brazil, which is something that Brazil has always looked forward to, because aside from United States or Europe or Japan for that matter, China is one of the major investors in, especially in its infrastructure projects. And so this is something that the Brazilian president seems to undo the damage that has happened, but also to regain confidence from investors in China and Chinese industries there. There is also the fact that Brazil is looking for also an export market, which is not necessarily entirely tied to the West. Because considering, you just need to look at the statements that Lula and his ministers have made about how the US is not entirely capable of absorbing what Brazil has to offer at its current situation. So it really needs an economy, a market like China. So there is that, and there is also a very clear line that is being drawn about investments, where Lula has talked about how he does not want Chinese companies to take over Brazilian companies, but to build things that Brazil needs. And that's a very clear line where you need obviously friendly relations with a major economic power, but you also need to know, but you're also telling them what you need and what you do not need, essentially. And what you do not need is any kind of fiscal, financial, or corporate intervention from a foreign power. And that is something that shows, like, gives an outline of what the Brazilian president expects to happen in the current visit.
Now, Lula has been in government for a little over 100 days, and she came in with a lot of expectation, including from being perhaps considered single-handedly the person who is entrusted with saving the Amazon. From there to expanding Brazil's social security network, increasing representation and participation of its indigenous peoples in the day-to-day sort of running of government as well as social services. A lot is expected, and things are happening as well. Brazil is now, Dilma Rousseff is heading the BRICS Bank. So, in a sense, this visit is also part of the process of bringing Brazil back onto the geopolitical map as a major player after the battering that the country took under Bolsonaro, like you were pointing out.
Yeah, so that is an interesting development that we're seeing because obviously under Lula, Brazil had uh, was considered this one of these emerging economies, and like the whole BRICS thing, the BRICS bloc emerging as nomenclature in day-to-day international affairs reporting is primarily because of the efforts that Brazil took, along with obviously India and China and and Russia as well. But it's just that the Brazil was at the heart of this movement towards creating a unipolar, world order that will not be dependent on just a handful of economic superpowers in the West who were not even at the time capable enough of controlling crisis in their own backyard. Obviously this Lula's comeback is also in a way Brazil's comeback to the international stage, and obviously we need to consider this other major agenda that Lula is bringing with his visit to Beijing, which is a peace process for Ukraine, the war in Ukraine. And obviously, Lula has made his own set of statements. So did his government about what they think will be a workable solution for the war right now. Obviously, there are issues that were taken up by not just the Ukrainian government but also several Western governments who did not want to cede any ground whatsoever or make any compromises in the war, even if it means that it can actually give a long-term peace solution. Nevertheless, the fact that Brazil wants China to be involved, which already has given out its own statement, its own proposal for the peace process in Ukraine, shows that Lula is looking for a multilateral intervention and not just a Western mediated intervention in the current crisis. He wants major powers outside of the West as well to be part and to actively participate in a peace process that can actually give results. They're not giving us like a hard set solution as of now, a proposal that needs to be imposed, but a proposal that needs to be talked out and negotiated between two countries. And so definitely this attempt by Lula is quite commendable, considering the fact that it's not just an attempt to look at, to bring back Brazil into the international stage as a political power that has its own weight and its own, independent foreign policy, but also, to create some kind of workable solution for what is considered right now one of the biggest humanitarian crises in the century. So definitely these factors, this is definitely as a part of this entire meet, and we can expect some results in the coming months. Definitely.
Yeah, it will, of course, like we were talking earlier, Anish, be a long and hard process because it will involve sort of having many people, many nations with their own agendas buying into it, not the least allies of the United States who are perhaps on a slightly different track, and that kind of takes us into the next part of our show today, Anish, which is looking at this massive scale military exercise in the South China Sea between the US and the Philippines, but also other countries involved in that. Over 17,500 troops taking part in these exercises that will last a couple of weeks and include the mock destruction of a ship or a vessel in the South China Sea. Not sort of the kind of theatrics or exercises or whatever you want to call it that at this point perhaps are the most encouraging from a wider perspective of building that lasting peace?
Yeah, definitely not at all encouraging. But considering the fact that the direction that the Marcos Jr. administration and the Philippines have taken for the past few months, especially its inclination to, bring Philippines back into the sort of sphere of influence of the US and its allies in the region, is definitely creating a lot of tensions. We have already talked about the expansion of US military presence in Philippines, especially giving new bases or access to new bases in areas not only just close to the South China Sea dispute in Palawan, but also in Luzon, very close to the island of Taiwan, which is again another flashpoint in the ongoing US-China tensions that we're seeing in the region. So this sort of invitation that has been this blank invitation that has been given to the United States to intervene in a dispute that has nothing to do with the United States to begin with is obviously disconcerting. We have to remember that this is not the only sort of what many media houses are calling a war games that is happening in the region. We've seen joint exercises and military drills, some of the biggest ones happening in Thailand, happening in Korea, along with Japan. And these are essentially part of exercises where the US is trying to project its military strength in the region. We've also seen as China was winding down its military drills in near the Taiwanese territorial waters. We saw these tensions happening with a U.S. warship going through the mainland China Taiwan region in what it terms to be a freedom of movement or a freedom of navigation exercise. And this is kind of absurd because to begin with, the entire idea of freedom of navigation only concerns civilian vessels, not warships of a military and a nuclear superpower which has no territory in the region to begin with. But the fact that these tensions are being aggravated right now is the most disconcerting at this point.
And quite an incredible lack of subtlety on that front as well, Anish. We'll close it at that. Anish, thanks very much for your time today. And also with that, we'll lead into our final story of the day, where we are joined by Prabir Purkasta, Editor-in-Chief of NewsClick, to talk about the not so subtle impact actually of the United States' prolonged military engagements in Southeast Asia, but also the impact that we've seen in more recent times after the 20-year war in Iraq. Prabir, thanks for joining us on this final segment of Daily Debrief for today. We've pegged this story to a new book out by George Black, 50 years after the last American soldier left Vietnam after the war there, looking at the environmental impact and the long-term kind of impact on the country. And of course, there are headlines that talk about what the US leaves behind and the kind of destruction it's caused in Southeast Asia, but it could well be the entire world. And in the current context, I guess the most recent disengagement that we've had to kind of look at is the 20-year war in Iraq. Now, US veterans who served in Iraq have very recently won a legal battle to get some kind of compensation for these burn pits and the kind of health impacts they've had. But there is something lacking in the US assessment of the problem.
Oh, I don't think there's anything specifically lacking in the US assessment of the problem. I think US is known very well that when it fights a war, well, whatever the effect on that country is, that is something which doesn't appear on its balance sheet. So, what stays with them is the American veterans of the war who come back to the United States and face the consequence of the war in terms of post-traumatic stress disorders and also different health effects because of the kind of activities that the US Army has, or the Air Force, US forces have carried out of these places. You were talking about the Iraq, for instance, the burn pits. Now, burn pits, what were being burnt? So, all kind of toxic elements were being burned there, even refrigerators being thrown in, shells being thrown in. But the point is not that the what was being burnt, but the way it was being burnt.
Yeah.
So if you incinerate waste, there are specific ways of doing it. Putting it to burn it, setting it on fire with jet fuel, which is what seems to have happened, is obviously not the best way of doing it. And the consequences, of course, all around that the surrounding areas of the burn pits. And I think more than 150 such burn pits in Iraq. There would be a huge number of people who had an exposure to extremely harmful chemicals over a long period of time. So it would mean cancer, it would also mean leaching into the soil of various harmful elements. But all of that is forgotten. What has been registered is the Iraqi veterans who had a long battle to fight, because the US is not unaware of the fact that they compensate their veterans.
Yeah.
Of course, they're open to also at least the argument, what about the Iraqis? Of course, as we know from what you've talked about the Vietnam issue, for example, the amount of what was given to Vietnam for the Agent Orange over there, which is even today causes birth defects, is something which is extremely small. So we know that really the compensation does not happen. But the scale of the destruction, I think both in Vietnam and now in Iraq, on a lesser scale, but still on a certain scale definitely which has an impact. I think the important part is, yes, X number of US servicemen. I think in this case it's how much? It's 800,000 US servicemen.
In Vietnam, but
No,
they're saying in Iraq up to 3.5 million actually might be exposed to burn pit related health effects.
You're right. The Iraqi armed forces is 3.5 million. But if you take Vietnam, it's actually much larger, both in terms of the soldiers who served over there, but of course in terms of the population, it's a much larger population that is exposed, because unlike burn pits which are localized, Vietnam, the issue was really to destroy the vegetation, deny the people food, and while doing that, used defoliants which are known to be carcinogenic and known to be iatrogenic, that means harm the fetus of unborn children. So all this was known, though the US Army denied for a long time that Agent Orange could cause all of this. But after a certain point of time, they had to accept, yes, this was the reason. But the point that you're raising is really absolutely the right issue. What happened to all the Vietnamese people who suffered the consequences? What happens to what happened to their agriculture? You know, during the Second World War, there was a move at one point to destroy Japanese rice crops. And at that time, the opinion was that this is inhuman. This violates all tenets of just war, all tenets of war itself. That was the reaction, and they didn't do it. But when it came to Vietnam, that didn't operate. That yes, destruction of the crops was the issue. Of course, they said the Ho Chi Minh Trail, taking away the forest cover, all that was there. But a large part of it was to deny food. And the fact is, you are denying Vietnamese rebels food, but of course you are denying the whole Vietnamese people food. That was the whole consequence of the use of Agent Orange, both as defoliants on forests, but also destroy crops. The burn pits is a continuation of that story, if you will, that it really shows that in this 150 burn pits, I think the number is little more than 150, burn pits which burned for years virtually, because it was non-stop, that if you have exposure of 3.5 million war veterans, as they're called, then what happens to the Iraqis? And is there even a talk about compensating them? And the issue is really that in any of the American wars, you break up countries, you destroy the infrastructure of that country, you destroy the health of the people, but at the same time, you at one point you declare your job is done, then you go back.
Yeah.
And then you have the angst of the war veterans, which comes in Hollywood movies, in the serials, everywhere. And when you
In this
talk,
case with Joe Biden, a particularly personal sort of connection
His son.
with his son. Yeah.
yes, his son is supposed to have died of such exposure,
Yeah.
and therefore he was sensitive to this issue, and therefore perhaps that this
An added impetus to pass the bill.
pass the bill. But what I'm saying is that all of this is about Americans. It's about American soldiers. It is not about the Iraqis and the Vietnamese. And that's been the nature of the American self-absorption, if you will, about all the wars that America has been involved with. So that doesn't seem to stop.
All right, thanks very much, Prabir, for that. Right, so the book is The Long Reckoning by veteran reporter George Black. You can, of course, check that out if it is of interest to you. Let us also know what you think if you do happen to read it. Let us also know what you think of the show. Write into us, like, comment, share, of course. Do subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. As always, we invite you to head to our website, peoplesdispatch.org, for more details on these stories and all of the other work we do. Don't also forget to give us a follow on the social media platform of your choice. We'll be back same time, same place tomorrow. Until then, goodbye.